Welcome to Stories from the Breakroom, where the real stories of work come to life.
Hello, and welcome to the global premiere of Stories from the Breakroom, the podcast. I am Nora Burns, and I will be your host and your guide on this adventure. Now, some of you might be here because you're already familiar with my work. Perhaps I have keynoted a conference that you attended, or facilitated training or a leadership retreat in-house for your organization. Perhaps you follow me on LinkedIn, or you might have already pre-ordered my book. Thank you. And for others, this might be our very first time meeting. Whatever brought you here, I'm so grateful that you're on this journey with me. Now, for this episode number 1, I would like to set some groundwork. What is the history? What's the research that led to this podcast? What are we planning to do with the podcast? What will the format look like on a go-forward basis, or at least what's the plan right now? So that's what we're going to cover in this very first episode. Now, some of you are thinking, Nora, I already know the story. I just saw you speak at a conference. And I'm okay with wherever you want to take this podcast because I'm a fan and I'm going to tune in. Well, great. You can just scooch on over to episode 2, or you can stay and hang out. Whichever you choose. For this episode, we're going to talk about the story that led to the stories. How did we get here? And what's the plan? How can we help you grow and develop as a leader? It all started while I was consulting with a client on redesigning, reimagining their hiring process. Now, I had done this for a variety of clients in the past, but on this particular day, there was just this moment of clarity. I have always had a great appreciation for shifting perspective and looking at a problem through a variety of different lenses. But suddenly, on this day, it occurred to me that here I was designing hiring practices and processes, and I hadn't been a job candidate in over a decade. What? I needed to do a 360 on the hiring process in order to be better at my job as a consultant in that area. So I decided I'd go on a handful of interviews, chose a town near where I live, but not my city. I figured it'd be less likely I would be recognized in the lobby if I drove a little bit outside of my town. And I decided to go on a handful of interviews. So I went on a half dozen interviews for a variety of positions, from receptionist, office manager, accountant, and kind of see what was happening from the candidate's perspective and how that could make me better as a consultant in the hiring space. And quite frankly, I was a little shocked by what I experienced. And, well, actually, let's say horrified. I was being asked questions that have no business in a job interview. Some because they're unethical, some because if you make the decision based on that question, it could be construed as discriminatory or illegal. Now, I'd like to point out right now that I am not an employment attorney or an attorney of any kind. You should always consult an attorney regarding your hiring process. Talk to your internal or external employment attorney regarding some of those questions. But I was being asked things that shouldn't have been asked since like 1965. So bad questions, lazy interviewing, poor communication, no follow-up. And I thought this cannot be the norm of what's happening in the hiring process across this country. So I was talking to my business coach about it and saying, hey, I think I need more data because I love me a good spreadsheet. I needed more data. And we decided that I would go on at least 100 interviews. 100 interviews from coast to coast. Now, I have well surpassed that. This project we call the Undercover Candidate. Over 250 job interviews across the country, from Washington State to Washington, D.C. and back again. I have crisscrossed the country and industries. I've interviewed with manufacturing, with hospitality. I have interviewed with insurance as an actuary and as an accountant. Some HR interviews, I will admit that those were the easiest ones for me. Some in warehousing. Across the country and across industries, across the organizational chart, so that I could have a really solid understanding of what the hiring process, of what our trends look like in the real world. Now, when I started sharing with organizations in keynotes and training, in workshops and breakouts, some of the things that I learned, some of the trends that I uncovered, and the 5 key elements that we look into when we audit hiring processes now. People would sometimes ask, like, hey, did you take any of those jobs? And the answer to that question is no. Because as the undercover candidate, all of those resumes and applications were filed under fictitious names and fictitious backgrounds. The only thing true on those applications is the fact that I am, in fact, over the age of 18, because just some things you can't get away with. So no, I didn't take any of those jobs because while I'm willing to do a lot for research into workplace culture, a felony is not among them. So that wasn't an option for those applications. But it did plant the seed. And over time, I started to wonder, I wonder what would happen if I interviewed under my own name. As much as I tell hiring managers, please do not Google the names of your candidates. I know that so many of them do. And I didn't want to be uncovered before I could even get to the interview. Now, the reason I don't want you to Google your job candidates, by the way, is that you can't unring that bell. A, you don't know if you're going to get the right person. Might be a different person with the same name. And B, there might be information out there that you uncover that has nothing to do with the relevancy of their ability to do the job. It might even be protected class information about their marital status, about health conditions, about a wide variety of things. So please don't do that. So anyhow, I thought, let's see what happens. So I did some reverse SEO on my website at the time. It's a different website than I have now. And I also took some gig work so that I could have some real experience to share and tell stories about in these frontline interviews. I got some stories there too. And I went out and I conducted one interview. I decided to go on one interview as a candidate under my own name. I chose a Fortune 500 organization for a frontline position in my home city. And we got partway through the interview and I thought, oh, this isn't going to work because they asked me a question about scheduling, but I'd already seen the glimmer. You know, the glimmer, it's the moment that I know that a hiring manager wants to offer me that job. It's that little glimmer that says, ooh, you're the one. It happens in dating too. Actually, a lot of similarities between dating and interviewing. But you know, if you remember like going on a first date and that moment where you see the little glimmer where you're like, they want to go on a second date. The same thing happens in interviewing. You see the moment that they fall in love with you as a job candidate. And then anything you say after that moment, they rationalize away. We call it the halo effect. So the halo effect is when one thing shines so brightly that your hiring team cannot see anything else. So sometimes it's something about like, oh, where did you go to school or where did you work before or any of these types of things. But the glimmer shows up. So on this interview at this very first place as the undercover employee, I saw the glimmer. And it was after that glimmer that I gave them a big red flag, which we'll talk about in a future episode. And they should not have offered me the job, but they did. So I came home and I pondered it for some time. And then I called that business coach back. And I said, well, you know how we came up with the plan for the undercover candidate? I'm thinking of doing the undercover employee. And we talked it through. And then I talked to some HR pros and I talked to some ethicists. And we came up with a plan that I would work for at least 1 year and at least 3 different jobs. always working at least one job. They didn't have to overlap, but I would always be employed through that year on a frontline position with a Fortune 500 organization. Now, it turns out that I worked for 15 months and at 5 different organizations. And the most I ever worked at one time was 3 jobs. It just happened that about the time I was ready to leave and take that next job, something interesting would happen and I'd have to stick around to see how they sorted it out. Now, those organizations, while they knew my real name, they did not know that I have a background in human resources and organizational development. They did not know and still don't know that I am a former Fortune 200 leader. They saw me as one in a long line of polyester uniform wearing employees. I was ringing up orders. I was stocking the shelves. I was cleaning bathrooms. I got to tell you, people are a little disgusting. Take better care of those public restrooms, please. I was doing frontline jobs at big organizations with all of the resources to do a really good job with employee engagement and lowering their turnover. And I have a book's worth of stories about things that didn't go so well. I do have some examples of things that went very well. But unfortunately, the bulk went on the oof, oh, it wasn't great side of the story. But one of the coolest things as the undercover employee was sitting in the break room and talking with fellow employees. Because as much as a consultant in the area of human resources and in my career as an HR professional, employees confided in me a lot. I just have one of those faces. I'm the person who sits on the airplane and the person sitting next to me tells me their whole life story. Doesn't matter if I have on the headphones and my computer up and all of that. I just have one of those faces. So people will confide in me quite a bit, but nowhere near the way that they did when I was wearing the same uniform, working the same job on the front line, and I was a peer. Sitting in that break room, I learned a lot about workplace culture. What employees think about, what they talk about, what they share. And as proud as I am of the time that I worked as an executive and how connected I was to the front lines, I understand the front line better now than I ever have. But my stories are under my own bias. My stories come from my perspective and the perspectives of those employees that would share their stories with me in those break rooms. But that's a pretty small sample size. So now I want to reach beyond my own experience as the undercover employee, and I want to hear from you. I want to know what your stories are. What's going really, really well at work? What managers have found a way to provide reward and recognition in a meaningful way? What do you love about the organization that you work for? What's going really, really well? And also, what are the things that are major pain points for you? Where you wish someone would help leaders to better understand how to provide feedback, how to schedule employees, how to talk with employees, how to help navigate conflict. What are the things that you are experiencing day in and day out as a worker in the American employment system? I'm very focused on the U.S. workforce. And I'm thankful if you are listening to this podcast in Europe, in Asia, in Africa. I'm so thankful that you are listening to this podcast. But the stories, the collective, the knowledge that I have relates to the American workforce. Where I can help is tied to the American workforce. The experts that I plan to bring in understand the American workforce. So I would love to hear your stories. So the progression of this podcast came about because of the undercover candidate research, and then because of the undercover employee research, and then saying, how do I access the stories beyond my own experience that was limited to here in Denver, Colorado, and for a woman who looks like me. I want to hear your stories and expand the collective of stories from our workforce. So friends and fans and people who've heard me speak have been handing out cards across the country that ask people to submit their stories online. And you can do that at our website on storiesfromthebreakroom.com that will lead you to a survey. And also, we've now added a phone number so people can call in and add a 5-minute story. So if your story is 5 minutes or less, you can call in and record it on our voicemail line. Now, I am looking for relatively current stories, things that have happened in the last year. We'll do a flashback episode, so feel free to call in and give me older stories, but our primary focus is going to be on what's been going on right now in the American workforce. And the folks we're looking to hear from work in a variety of different industries and a variety of different roles. The only things they are not executives, they are not owners, and they are not independent contractors. Beyond that, man, I want to hear from you. When these stories come in, we look for themes. And then based on those themes, we will build out episodes. So we will share some of the stories and then talk to experts in that area to explore how can leaders do better if it's a negative. How can leaders do better in that particular area? If it's a really great positive story, how can other organizations take on ideas similar to that to make sure that their leaders are providing such an exceptional experience for their workers as well? Now, we will maintain your confidentiality and your privacy. I have never, ever provided the names of the organizations where I worked as the undercover employee. And I get asked that question a lot. And the reason I don't is that it's not about blame and shame. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about what do we recognize in terms of the trends in the workplace? What are the patterns? What are the things that we can get ahead of? How can we become stronger leaders that reduce turnover, that have engaged employees who really want to be there? All too often, and you're going to hear me say this a lot, if you keep listening, you will keep hearing this particular thing. It's an employment relationship. All too often, we remember the employment, the paperwork, the payroll, the taxes, the benefits, and we forget the relationship, the communication, the empathy, the humanness of work. The two go hand in hand. Employment is available in a vast variety of areas. A really strong relationship, that's harder to come by. Our stories relate to that relationship. It relates to how we communicate, how we talk to one another, how we appreciate one another, respect, and show empathy. It's an employment relationship. We get better by focusing on the relationship. And stories, all about relationship. As we look for themes in the stories that come in, we will plan to share them. Those of you that leave your stories on the storyline with an audible recording, and if you give us permission to use that audible recording, that's great. I will also be looking for the ability to garble it a little bit so it can still be heard, but that your voice is varied. We have a great editor working on this podcast who I'm sure can make that happen. But I will never disclose your name. I will never disclose the name of the organization that you call in or leave us a story about. Because this isn't about blame and shame. This is about making sure that we hear the collective of the American story and that we provide insight and guidance on how to manage and navigate some of those situations, how leaders can embrace the great and lose the bad, how we can all build a stronger workforce together. I'm thrilled to be your host and your guide on this adventure. And I look forward to a hopefully long, long life with stories from the break room. But it is 100% dependent on your stories. Please go call one in now. I sure would love to hear from you. Whatever your story, I'm listening. I'm Nora Burns, and I'll see you next time.